Hi, Misha here, and as promised, we're going to have a closer look at jets used by the British RAF and Navy in the 20th and 21st centuries. And we're going to begin with planes dating back to World War II. I've got 10 that were in the preview, and I don't think you want 10 episodes, so I'm probably going to combine these 2 planes per video. And full disclosure, I don't know much about British planes. I really don't. I just think they're interesting. So we are going to look at the Havilland Vampire. But first, we look at the first. The Gloster Meteor. And this is the F3 variant, which is a relatively early variant. Well, it is very early, actually. Both models are from Corgi. And not only was this the first British jet in the RAF, this was the British jet that kind of got me into wanting British jets a while back. I picked this one up quite before any of the rest because I just thought it was an interesting place in history, represented by this model. The Gloster Meteor was the sole fully operational jet fighter used by the Allies in the Second World War. Germany had the Messerschmitt 262. America had the P-59, and towards the end they had a few, just a couple, 3 or 4, P-80s, but this was actually quite in full service. And it was developed more or less concurrently with the Messerschmitt. Well, this all kind of begins in the 1930s with a gentleman, Sir Whittle. He had the idea for a new jet engine, what we know today as a jet, getting away from piston prop style. As a result, he founded a company in 1936 called Power Jets and began working on a design, various experiments and things. In 1939, he introduced himself to the Gloster Company, and a partnership was quickly formed. Early on, the government really wasn't interested, but then World War II began. They became slightly interested. Then France and Dunkirk happened, and they became quite interested, so there was government support. By 1940, work had begun on an airframe to go with Whittle's engine, and in 1941, the first prototype, not of this plane, but of any British jet at all, took a flight. It was always just a prototype, kind of a proof of concept. It was a single-engine craft. It did not have enough power to do anything for the military. It was just seeing if they could make a jet fly. And they did in 1941. The government was reasonably impressed and placed an initial order to proceed and said they were interested. Originally they said they wanted 100 planes, and they said 300. Fast forward to March of 1943, and the prototype of the Meteor, which really was almost identical to the later F1, flew. While they did experience some issues, most of them all had to do with the airframe and such. The engines themselves, and they went to 2 with this, performed very well. They had to use 2 engines, at least they thought they did, because of the relatively low power, and a military craft needed to be able to carry ordnance and all of that. So we have very, modern engines, but we're still a very traditional design otherwise. We have straight wings. This was armed with 4 20mm cannon. It could drop bombs, at least later versions could, and it could fire dumbfire rockets. After the success of the prototype, these were put into production. The first F1 was ready to go by January of 1944 and was sent to the 1st Squadron in 1944 in July, and actually was already in the air that month and taking combat. Originally, these were used in Britain over UK skies to intercept V-1 flying bombs. The government was very reluctant to send meteors over Europe for fear of one being shot down and captured and thus examined by the Germans. So they were used basically as a home guard type thing originally, which wasn't bad. It gave the pilots time to learn how to handle the planes and adjust to their quirks. To that end, in August of 44, the F-3, this version here, first flew. The F-2 never existed, and of course the F-3 would go into production a short time later, replacing the F-1. In October, they put their planes to good use. They did basically what we would think of as war games against B-24 bombers who had been encountering the Messerschmitt in Europe, and this was mutually beneficial. It helped the bombers figure out ways to combat, well, the bombers and their escorts, ways to combat the Messerschmitt, and it helped the Meteor pilots learn their plane more and develop new fighter tactics. Finally, in January 45, the first Meteors were stationed in Europe, but still weren't allowed to operate over Germany proper. Instead, they were used for kind of airfield defense and all of that and so on. They never really went up against the Messerschmitt. By March and April, at the end of the war, these were being used as reconnaissance planes, and they were being used as ground attack. They would also introduce the F-4, which had more improvements, and really F-1, F-3, F-4, the changes are minor. They are important. They did, for example, help increase the speed. Originally, this could barely do 450 miles per hour. By the end, they could get these up to 600 miles per hour, if just barely. They could climb up to 43,000 feet, so about the same as a P-51 Mustang. The different versions would have slightly different lengths of the fuselage, but it was about 45 feet, with about a 37-foot wingspan, and a crew of 1 is standard. They would continue making these after the war. In fact, they would keep making versions. They would kind of come up with what is thought of as the penultimate version, the F-8, in 1948, 1949, and this would see use in the Korean War. While it was a vast improvement over the F-3 and even F-4, the F-8 was still outclassed by newer jets like the F-86 Sabre and, of course, the MiG-15. So its days were already numbered. That said, they were still not only using these, they still kept this in production at Gloster through 1955. In the 1950s, they were using these more increasingly as reconnaissance and so on planes. They were taking them out of frontline use. They were more used for ground attack and reconnaissance. So they weren't throwing them into frontline, which is good. And then finally, but in 1956, they would take the Meteor out of frontline service, and it would be used as a training plane through the 60s. And they would produce a lot of them, at least, relatively so. Just under 4,000, including all variants and styles, like 3,950. Quite an impressive number. Especially for one of the earliest jets. And it definitely has a look all its own. Kind of both old and new. This would be replaced in the day fighter role by the Hawker Hunter. And the Gloster Javelin. So Gloster would keep on for a bit. Not bad for the first, not bad at all. Most planes of its era did not last near as long as it did. I mean, some nations outside of the UK were flying these through the 60s and even 70s. Well, why don't we move on to the Meteor's little cousin. So, the Havilland Vampire. It's an interesting story in and of itself. Another Sir Tizard, looked at Sir Whittle's engines, at least the Progress, around 1940, and thought that a single-engine military aircraft was possible, and approached de Havilland of Mosquito fame with some ideas. Thus, in 1941, a project at the company started up. It really wasn't endorsed, it wasn't funded by the government, it was an internal de Havilland project. The government did look at it and give it its blessing, and occasionally would order prototypes and things. But basically, this was kept around in the beginning as an experimental kind of prototype testbed plane. It wasn't ever really intended to go into full production. Make a few prototypes here or there, but, try things out. And, have a backup if the Meteor completely didn't work out. So work continued throughout 1942. And actually the prototype, at the time known as the DH-100 Spider Crab. Yeah, I think Vampire is probably a little better name for a military jet, but I digress. Flew in September of 1943, so only about 6 months later than the Meteor. And what de Havilland came up with was indeed a single-engine plane, jet. It has intakes on either side of the cockpit, and then it has a split tail, kind of P-38 style, with the exhaust in between. Because it only has one engine, this is a smaller plane. It's only about 30 feet long, has a slightly wider wingspan than the Meteor at about 38 feet, but to save on weight, using lessons and things they had learned from the Mosquito, de Havilland actually built quite a bit of this plane out of wood. I mean, metal was used where necessary, but a lot of wood was used in it. This was good for conserving resources during war. Of course, it has downsides too. I mean, termites. Anyway, it was armed, and from the beginning it was always planned to be armed with 4 20mm cannon, just like the Meteor. And actually, pretty early on, again, thanks to the Mosquito, the government was really encouraging de Havilland to make their plane a bomber, like a light attack bomber. But they really wanted to make a fighter. So that's what came out. The test flight went well. And actually, the next year, the government changed its mind and ordered the DH-100 into production and planned to buy 300. But de Havilland was really booked up with projects, did not have any leftover capacity. They could research and test, but they really couldn't manufacture. So ultimately, a lot of these were made by English Electric. They were put into production, and the first production model flew in April of 1945, but when the war ended, only 6 had been turned out of the factory. So this did not see service in World War II. But it did the next year. It was adopted by the RAF in 1946. They would use it as an interceptor. It was also tested in 1945 by the Navy, the Royal Navy, who, while they had some Meteors, they only used them as land-based aircraft, never as carrier-based. Well, this is a little smaller, a little more, efficient. So they tried this out on board a Royal Navy carrier in late 1945, and it actually was the first jet to operate from a carrier. To that end, in 1947, the de Havilland Vampire became the Royal Navy's first operational jet. It was England's second jet overall and first single-engine jet. And really, the single engine didn't cost it a whole lot. It was a little bit slower than the Meteor, about 550 miles per hour max, and had a slightly lower altitude, but it had a longer range because of less fuel consumption. So it was a trade-off. In the 1950s, this was becoming quite a dated plane. It didn't really receive a lot of the attention like the Meteor and wasn't kept as up to date. Plus, it's made of wood. It was used a lot in reconnaissance, and they even would come up with a bomber variant, which could carry rockets or two 500-pound bombs. But really, by 1953, the Vampire was out of Navy and RAS frontline service. It was kept as a training and kind of second-line craft through the 50s, and the last of these were retired out in the 60s. So it had a briefer career than the Meteor, but it was in no way inferior. It had some benefits. The Meteor had some benefits, but it was a product of its time. It lasted about as long as most of the aircraft of its day did, frankly. And they would actually make quite a few of these, about 3,200. So it wasn't a small production run. Not at all. But after Korea, the world would move on. I'm not really saying much about the Corgi models because I've done individual videos talking about them. So if you're interested in their features and everything, check those out. The two you've seen so far have both been from the Aviation Archive, so they have landing gear options. And neither of these do, but later ones will have ordnance that can be put on. This early on, they just had mostly guns. But, yeah, pretty nice models, and they're cheaper than Hobby Master, and they're very solid. That Meteor especially. This one, because of being a smaller frame, is not as heavy, but that Meteor has some serious weight to it, which I like. Well, I appreciate you joining me for the first episode in this look at British military jets. Any questions or comments, please do post them below. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And this is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.